My name is Tim, you're watching Cybersports, and we're coming at you at the last day at the Rift Rivals here in Berlin. And with me, I have a bit of an interviewing legend, really, so it's a bit fun to be on the other side of this. Hey, Kelsey, how you doing?
I'm doing all right, so I'm not sure if I'm interviewing legend, but thank you for the compliment anyway.
Well, it's something to aspire to, if nothing else. We've had a couple of chats today about the current progress of Europe, and I reckon that's kind of what we're going to have to talk about, because let's be honest, they were weighed, they were measured, and they were severely found wanting. What gives? What's happened to us? I mean, didn't we go into this being like the favourites, or is that just what everybody thought?
I did kind of weight Europe as maybe a little bit of the favourites, but it's weird because I've gone back over some of the stuff that I said about Europe and NA going into this tournament for the weeks leading up, and there were definitely weeks where I felt like the best NA teams were playing better than the best European teams. It's just that I wasn't really convinced by Cloud9 and Team Solomid's trajectory going into this event, because they took a little bit to ramp up and to get back into form after they took an extended break. So it was just really hard for me to make it in NA's favor at that time. I think a really big issue to note is that G2 were really, really far ahead of the rest of Europe if we go back and we remember spring, and they got a little bit better at MSI, and then suddenly when they're going into summer and you notice that they're visibly struggling with the meta, like that should have been a signal that Europe is behind or that Europe is struggling overall, because there's no reason for the rest of the teams to just suddenly catch up that dramatically, right? It has to be a problem with G2, and I think that that's what we need to look at when we decide what happened with Europe.
Okay, so essentially they've not actually improved at all. The top just kind of stumbled and fell down the stairs again.
I would say that that's accurate. I mean, Fnatic are still playing the same kind of stuff that they played in spring. Unicorns are still playing the same kind of stuff that they played in spring. Misfits maybe is one of the better teams that we saw some improvement from. Splice, one of the better teams that we saw some improvement from, but they're not improving above the rest, right? They're just playing like a little bit different from before. So I think it's hard to say that anyone made huge market progress, and I think it's just the top of the league just fell down pretty hard.
Okay. Well, we're kind of looking at Unicorns playing against TSM right now. In what, caveat, we haven't seen the final game yet, but it looks to be going one way. And a lot of what we see with the Unicorns seems to be this like blind focus on scaling comps. There's no attention to the early game. And you've been talking quite a bit about this as well, you know, this almost like tunnel vision to this mythical late game fight. Mm-hmm. But have they always done that? We used to know Unicorns as kind of an aggressive team, whereas right now they seem to be like weirdly passive until they can cross the 20-minute mark. What's going on with the team right now from your perspective?
I wouldn't necessarily say they're passive. I think that there are definitely issues that they can't take advantage of. And you have to look at Exile. It's not necessarily saying, okay, everything is his fault, but you can tell that he isn't really up to date on a lot of the matchups that are really popular in mid. He's going back to things that aren't necessarily super meta, like the Ryze, the Vladimir, that are just very specific counter picks. And the games that the Unicorns won were situations where the North American teams were blind picking their mid lane, and then he could pick these specific counter picks that just coincidentally were within his pool, like the Vladimir into the Syndra, the Kassadin into the LeBlanc. And then if those matchups are deceptively pretty good so that the enemy mid laner doesn't get complete control of the laning phase. But what happens when the enemy mid laner gets complete control of the laning phase is that you see the enemy jungler has a much easier time getting in and denying the enemy jungle camps, being able to go to other sides of the map. Because if you have mid lane pushed, it's hard for the enemy jungle to punish your jungler for making moves on one side of the map or something of that nature. So the amount of choices that they have just opens up that much more. So everyone's praising the NA junglers really hard, but I think what you have to do is you have to instead praise the understanding of the North American teams for the meta in terms of understanding how important like having a strong mid lane champion and a strong mid lane matchup is and how to use that, instead of just the NA junglers themselves.
Yeah, because you also mentioned with, speaking of NA junglers, you did mention earlier as well the almost like ritualistic focus on stealing blue. Sure. It's just go blue, go blue, go blue. And we saw it a couple of times in these games as well. And Europe tends to have prided itself on strong junglers, on like a jungle presence, so to speak. But at no point have we like called them out on the fact that Svenskeren is very predictable. You know, it's just going blue, going blue. Is that a new thing for us? Because I feel like, especially in this tournament, it seems like the jungle map has been a lot more divided in red side just gets the left side of the jungle, and blue side just gets the right side of the jungle. You know, there's almost like they just kind of swap down the middle. What is that? Is that lane pressure that I'm not seeing somewhere, or what's causing this kind of schism?
Yeah, usually when you see teams trade sides like that or do the vertical jungling, I think is the official sort of buzzword for it, is because you'll have a strong bot matchup and a strong top matchup on the other team, so it's just safer to take that half of the jungle for the jungler because they have a bot lane that can back them up, because the enemy, they don't have to waste time answering the push or anything like this. They can just automatically back them up. I think that's probably what's happening with the vertical jungling. When we talk about team solo mid and the blue buff, it has a lot to do with they really like to deny the enemy mid laner the blue buff, so it's really hard to answer this mid push. Usually they're allowed to do that either because of a lack of river control, which means that Team Solo Mid have a strong matchup on one side of the map and mid lane, and a lot of Team Solo Mid's flaws kind of come from they don't really have a very good ability to trade sides, so if they have one strong side, then they don't cover the weaknesses on their weak side very well. And the problem is, of course, like European teams aren't really exploiting that at this tournament because they're just drafting all weak lanes and all weak matchups, so they don't really have a weak side specifically in this case. And so there is an amount of predictability, but if you don't have the strong matchups, then the correct play, the expected play, is not something you can easily punish. You'll lose if you try to contest it, so there's really nothing that you can do in those particular instances.
Okay. One last question before we kind of wrap this up. Heading into Worlds right now, it's clear that Europe has been resting on its laurels. We thought we were up there with the best of them. We were doing pretty well, and then NA comes in here and pretty much humiliates us across the board. And they're not even playing that well. What do we need to change? What do we need to really pick up the slack on before we head into an international again with teams that are actually good? That's not to say that they're not good, but I mean, obviously that are beyond the criticisms of doubt, just solid teams. What do we need to fix before we can ever hope to face that?
Jungle mid synergy, just in particular, even if you're not drafting the strong matchups, even if you want to do something that's scaling, just understanding that if you do get an advantage in a lane, transition that into river control. Get the wards in the right place in river. And if you see some of the top teams, they don't even necessarily emphasize warding. They just emphasize vision denial from the enemy team. For example, SK Telecom, they don't necessarily have a ton of wards that they place if you look at their statistics, but they are very good, very diligent about keeping the jungle entrances around the Raptors clear, or knowing that if the enemy team has warded that, you can catch them if you clear their ward and they come back to refresh it. So I just think that understanding where your advantages are and what you can do and how to play with your jungler in particular around those advantages, rather than sort of the disjointed jungle mid that we've seen. G2 arguably have one of the better understandings of jungle mid in Europe, but really what they kind of just default to is I don't think Trick understands tempo really well right now, and part of that is because I think Trick used to just be really good at taking advantages of finding enemy camps that he can take and things of that nature. But when you end up having shorter or longer respawn times, he has space where he has to do something with a tempo advantage that isn't necessarily farming more camps. And you end up kind of in this situation where, okay, you give him this hard leash, which is really popular, is having bot lane or something give the jungler a hard leash, and then he ends up getting ahead of the enemy jungler, and then he either kind of just wanders around, or he tries a mid gank, or he doesn't even get like a good back timing or anything like that. And I think that this is definitely something that we have to look at Europe for, is that how are you playing around pushing lanes, and how are you using this time between the first clear and the second clear, the second clear and the third clear. And I think that that's like one of the biggest fundamental things that we can look at as a region to improve overall.
Oh, cool. Well, there you have it. If any of you have any ideas, obviously, put it in the comment section down below. And for more here on the Rift Rivals, stay tuned to cybersport.com. Cheers.